My nephew called me from the hospital parking lot, voice cracking, saying he had nowhere else to turn. That was 11 years ago. Last Tuesday, I came home from my brother's funeral to find every lock on my own shop changed and a handwritten note taped to the front door that said, "Retired, don't come back." I stood there in my funeral clothes, still holding the folded program with my brother's face on it, and I almost laughed. Almost. Because they had no idea what they'd just done. 4 days later, my nephew called again, this time from a lawyer's office begging me to answer. I let it go to voicemail. I had a plane to catch. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to Sincere Revenge Stories and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are. I lead every single one. Let me back up 11 years. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old, and for most of my adult life, I ran a small auto repair shop in Knoxville, Tennessee. Nothing glamorous. 4 bays, a lift that groaned when the weather changed, and a parking lot with a pothole I kept meaning to fix for about 9 years. But it was mine. I built it from nothing. After 22 years working at other people's shops, learning every mistake they made so I could avoid them myself. My wife Carol passed in 2012. Pancreatic cancer. She was 56 years old, and she was the kind of woman who remembered every customer's birthday and kept a little notebook of which mechanics preferred their coffee with clean. She was the real heart of the place, and when she died, I honestly didn't know if I had the stomach to keep going. My brother Ray had one son, Dylan. Ray was a good man, but never very good with money, and Dylan grew up knowing that and resenting it. By the time Dylan was in his late 20s, he had a technical degree from a community college, a chip on his shoulder the size of a transmission, and a girlfriend named Brooke who had very specific opinions about what their life was supposed to look like. The call from the hospital parking lot came about 8 months after Carol died. Dylan had just lost his job at a dealership. Something about inventory discrepancies that he swore weren't his fault. He had a new baby at home. Brooke wasn't working. He said he just needed a chance, just somebody to believe in him. I believed in him. I want to be clear about that, because everything that comes later only makes sense if you understand that I genuinely believed in that kid. I taught him how to change his first oil when he was 13. I watched him take apart an engine block just to see how it worked. The talent was real. Whatever had happened at the dealership, I thought it was bad luck, bad management, wrong fit. I thought what he needed was family around him. So I brought him on. 40 hours a week, good wages, health insurance for him and Brooke and the baby. I even gave him the title of shop manager after 2 years because he'd earned it and because I wanted him to feel ownership in the work. My one mistake was thinking that a title and a feeling of ownership were the same thing as actual ownership. They are not. The first few years were genuinely good. Dylan worked hard. He had a natural feel for customers, could explain problems in plain language without talking down to people, and he modernized some of our systems in ways that actually helped. We started doing computerized diagnostics, built a real online review presence. Revenue went up. I started taking Fridays off, something I hadn't done in 20 years. But somewhere around year 5, things began to shift in ways I told myself were just growing pains. Dylan started referring to the shop as we in ways that subtly excluded me. Not in front of customers. He was always smooth with customers, but in conversations with suppliers, with vendors, with the 2 new mechanics we'd hired, we are thinking about expanding the hours. We've decided to drop that parts distributor. We're looking at leasing the bay next door. Little things. Easy to explain away. Brooke started coming in more. She'd taken an online business management course and now had opinions about everything. The waiting room needed redecorating. The pricing structure was outdated. The logo looked grandpa-ish. That last one was said directly to me with a smile, like it was a compliment wrapped in an insult. I smiled back. I kept smiling for a long time. By year 7, I was coming in 4 days a week, gently. Then I'd stop by in the mornings and Dylan would give me this look, patient, slightly tired, the way you look at an elderly relative who's dropped by unexpectedly. And he'd say something like, "We've got it handled, Uncle Gerald. You should take it easy." I told myself he was being considerate. I told myself I'd earned some rest. I told myself a lot of things that let me keep believing the story I wanted to believe. Ray got sick in early 2033. Congestive heart failure, slow decline, the kind that drags everyone around it into its current. I started driving to Nashville every few weeks to sit with him, help with appointments, manage the things that pile up when someone can't manage for themselves anymore. Dylan knew. He said all the right things. "Don't worry about the shop, we are good. Focus on your dad. Focus on Uncle Ray." He'd almost said your dad. I noticed. I let it go. Ray died on a Wednesday in October. The funeral was that Saturday. I wore the same suit I'd worn to Carol's service. Let it out a little at the seams because 12 years will do that to a man. The church was small. The reception afterward was at Ray's neighbor's house. Casseroles and sweet tea and people telling me what a good brother he'd been. Which was true. I drove back to Knoxville that evening. The shop was dark when I pulled into the lot, which made sense. It was past 7. But something felt wrong before I even got to the door. A new light fixture over the entrance that I didn't recognize, a decal on the front window, partially applied, with a logo I'd never seen, and then the door and the key that turned halfway and stopped. New lock. Deadbolt, key different. Not a maintenance issue. A decision. I tried the back door. Same thing. I tried the side entrance we used for parts deliveries. Locked with a padlock I'd never bought. And then I saw the note, folded under a strip of blue painter's tape on the glass panel beside the front door. Retired. Don't come back. Management. My nephew had signed a note on my own door as management. I stood there for what felt like a long time. I was still in my funeral suit. The parking lot light buzzed and flickered. A car slowed on the street, probably wondering if we were open, then kept going. I took out my phone, looked at it, put it back in my pocket. I didn't call Dylan. I didn't call Brooke. I didn't call anyone. I drove to the diner 2 blocks away, sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee. I didn't blink, and I thought very carefully about what I actually knew and what I needed to find out. Here's what I knew. The shop was mine. I had built it. My name was on the original business license, on the lease for the property, on every significant contract the shop had ever signed. Dylan's title was shop manager, which I had given him verbally and reflected in his employment records, but which conveyed no ownership whatsoever. I had never sold the business. I had never transferred equity. I had never signed anything that changed the fundamental legal fact of who owned Gerald's Auto Repair. Here's what I needed to find out. Whether in 11 years of trusting family over paperwork, I had somehow allowed that fact to erode. I called my accountant at 8 the next morning. His name is Phil, and he has been handling my business taxes since 1998, which means he has seen every document, every filing, every return the shop has ever generated. I told him what had happened in about 60 seconds, keeping my voice flat and professional. The same voice I used when a customer needed to hear that their transmission was gone and the repair would cost more than the car was worth. Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald, you're the sole proprietor. Your name is on everything. There is no legal structure here that gives Dylan any ownership claim whatsoever. Is there any scenario where 11 years of operating authority changes that? Not without documentation. Did you ever sign anything transferring ownership? A partnership agreement? An LLC formation naming him as a member?" I hadn't. I knew I hadn't, but it was steadying to hear Phil say it. "Then you own the shop," he said. "What he did, changing those locks, that's not a business decision. That's trespassing." That was the word that landed hardest. Trespassing. My nephew in my shop, with my tools and my lease and my customer list, and the word that applied to him was trespassing. I thanked Phil and hung up. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a while and let myself feel the full weight of it, because that was the only time I was going to allow myself that particular indulgence. 11 years. His wedding was in my backyard. I held his firstborn in this hospital before Brooke's parents even arrived. Ray, my brother, gone 4 days now, would have been devastated to know what his son had done. But Ray was gone, and grief was a luxury I'd deal with later. Right now, I had a business to reclaim. My attorney is a woman named Margaret Holloway. She's been practicing business law in Knoxville for 30 years, and she has the calm, thorough energy of someone who has heard every family business disaster story at least twice. I was in her office by 10 that morning, with a folder of documents. Phil had emailed me overnight: business license, property lease, tax filings, payroll records, everything. Margaret reviewed them the way a surgeon reviews imaging, quietly, thoroughly, with no expression that told you anything until she was ready to tell you something. He has no legal claim, she said finally. None. You own the business. You own the lease. He was an employee, well compensated, with managerial authority you granted him. But an employee, when he changed those locks, he committed what is effectively criminal trespass and tortious interference with your business. What are my options? You could notify him in writing that his employment is terminated and demand he return any keys, codes, or property. You could pursue an emergency injunction to regain access today if necessary. You could also file a police report for the trespass, which creates a record if this escalates. She paused. Or, given that you have complete legal ownership, you could simply exercise that ownership quietly, without warning, and let the consequences speak for themselves. I asked her what that would look like. She told me. I was back in her office the next morning with my signature on 3 documents. The first was a formal termination letter for Dylan, effective immediately, citing abandonment of duties and unauthorized alteration of business property. The second was a letter to the property management company, notifying them that the current shop manager no longer had any authority over the lease and that I was resuming direct operational control. The third was an authorization for a licensed locksmith to change all entry locks on the property at my direction and under my legal authority as sole owner, with a copy of the business license attached, in case anyone asked. I did not contact Dylan. I did not contact Brooke. I did not warn them in any way, because they had not warned me. They had waited until I was at my brother's funeral to make their move, timed it for when I was at my most distracted and my most raw. They had assumed grief would slow me down. They had underestimated what 40 years of solving problems had done to my ability to think clearly under pressure. The locksmith met me at the shop on Thursday morning at 8. He was professional and efficient, and he had the new locks installed across all 3 entry points in under 90 minutes. I stood inside my own shop for the first time in 4 days and looked around at what they had done to it. The waiting room had been repainted, not a color I would have chosen, some kind of slate gray that felt more dental office than auto shop. But it wasn't damaged, just different. The logo decal I'd seen half applied to the front window was now fully up, a stylized wrench in a circle with the name DK Auto underneath. DK, Dylan and Kayla. I assumed. Brooke's legal name was Kayla, though everyone called her Brooke, a nickname from college I'd never fully understood. They'd replaced my name with their initials. On my window. On my building. I peeled the decal off myself, slowly and carefully, while the locksmith finished his work. The adhesive left a faint ghost of a circle on the glass. I'd deal with that later. For now, I wanted my window clean. I called both of my full-time mechanics, brothers named Cal and Tommy, who had worked for me for 6 and 9 years respectively, and told them what had happened. They were quiet for a moment. Then Cal said, "Mr. Gerald, we were wondering when you'd find out." I asked what he meant. He said Dylan had told them 2 weeks ago that I was stepping back permanently, and that the shop was transitioning to new ownership. They hadn't believed it entirely, he said, but they hadn't known how to reach me with Ray so sick. 2 weeks ago, while Ray was still dying, while I was driving back and forth to Nashville, Dylan had already been telling my employees that I was gone. I asked Cal and Tommy if they wanted to keep working for me, under my management, on the terms we'd always had. They both said yes before I finished the sentence. I went home and turned my phone back on. There were 11 missed calls from Dylan, starting Thursday afternoon, when he must have gone to the shop and found his key no longer worked. The first few were demanding, "Uncle Gerald, call me immediately. Something's wrong with the locks." And then confused, "I don't understand what's happening. Did you change the locks? Why would you change the locks?" And then something else started creeping into his voice. Not quite fear, but the first cousin of it. Brooke had called 4 times. Her voicemails were shorter and angrier. "This is not how adults handle things, Gerald. You need to call us back right now. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you are making a very serious mistake." I was not making a mistake. I had spent 2 days making very deliberate decisions. I also had a voicemail from a man who introduced himself as an attorney representing Dylan and Brooke, claiming they had established equitable ownership interests through years of operational investment and management, and suggesting we schedule a mediation before this situation escalates further. I played it twice, wrote down his name and number, and forwarded it to Margaret. Margaret called me back within the hour. I could hear the particular quality of calm in her voice that I had learned meant she was finding someone else's legal argument mildly amusing. "Equitable ownership through operational investment is a real legal concept," she said. "It also requires substantial evidence, a clear record of failed legal formalization, and the absence of a legitimate employment relationship, which they had. He was your employee, Gerald. He received wages and benefits. That is the opposite of the legal framework they'd need to establish an ownership claim." "So what do I do about the attorney?" "Nothing for now. Let me respond professionally and let them understand the landscape they're operating in. In my experience, when the legal reality becomes clear, these situations tend to resolve themselves." She paused. "What are you planning to do with the business?" I told her what I'd been thinking about since Thursday morning, sitting in that diner booth with the coffee I didn't drink. I wasn't going back to work full time. That ship had sailed, and honestly, even before all this, I'd been quietly ready for a different chapter. But I wasn't closing the shop either. What I was going to do was sell it, on my own terms, to a buyer I chose, for fair market value, and use the proceeds to finally take the trip Carol and I had always planned to take before she got sick. 2 weeks in Alaska, fishing in the Kenai Peninsula, seeing Denali doing the things we'd said someday to for 30 years. I called a business broker the next morning. His name was Robert Haynes, and he specialized in small commercial properties and operating businesses in the Knoxville area. He came to the shop on Friday, walked every bay, reviewed the financials Phil sent over, and gave me a valuation by end of day. The business, including equipment, customer accounts, and the remaining lease, had a market value between $280,000 and $313,000. He had 2 buyers already in his network who he thought would be interested. I told him to make the calls. I did not tell Dylan. I did not tell Booker. I did not respond to their attorney. I simply let the process move forward, the way it legally could, because I owned the business, and what I did with it was entirely my decision. I booked the Alaska trip that weekend. 2 weeks anchorage to Homer, with a fly fishing guide for 3 days on the Kenai. I bought new waders. I left my phone on airplane mode for 12-hour stretches and felt the particular peace of someone who has made their decisions and is done negotiating about them. The calls came anyway, of course. By the time I landed back in Knoxville, I had 34 missed calls from Dylan, 19 from Brooke, and 1 from their attorney that Margaret had already responded to on my behalf. There were also 2 voicemails from my cousin Patrice, who I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, apparently deputized by Dylan to reach me through alternate channels. I listened to Dylan's voicemails in order, the way you might read a book you already know the ending of. The early ones were still aggressive. He'd clearly gotten some encouragement from their attorney and thought the equitable ownership argument had legs. Then Margaret's response letter arrived, apparently because the tone shifted around day 6. Less legal, more personal, more desperate. "Uncle Gerald, I know what we did was wrong. I know the timing was wrong. I am asking you to let me explain. I'm asking you to give me a chance to fix this before you do something that can't be undone. Please, I have a family. I have kids. Where are we supposed to go? I sat with that one for a while. I want to be honest about that. I'm not made of stone, and Dylan's children are not responsible for what their parents did. There's a version of this story where I pick up the phone and have a conversation and find some middle ground. But here's the thing about middle ground. You can only find it when both people are standing on solid footing. Dylan had tried to take my name off my own window before I was even in the ground. He had told my employees I was gone while I was sitting in a hospital room watching his father, my brother, try to breathe. He had made his calculation about who I was and what I was worth, and he had been wrong about both. I was not interested in finding middle ground with someone who had done their math on my funeral timing. I texted him. One message, 3 sentences. The business sale closes in 2 weeks. You and Brooke will need to vacate the premises by then. I wish your family well. He called 11 times in the next hour. I didn't answer a single one. I want to tell you about the buyer because this part matters to me. His name is Marcus Webb. He's 38 years old. Grew up in East Knoxville, spent 8 years as a mechanic at a fleet maintenance company before deciding he wanted to run his own shop. He came in with his own financing pre-approved, asked smart questions about the customer base and the equipment condition, and at one point mentioned that he'd learned to change oil in his grandfather's driveway at age 9. That detail got me. I shook his hand a little firmer than necessary. We closed on a Thursday morning. $295,000, which was in the middle of the range Robert had given me, fair for both sides. Marcus brought his wife and his 9-year-old daughter, who sat in the waiting room coloring in a notebook while the adults signed papers. I gave Marcus my personal cell number and told him to call if he had questions about any of the equipment in the first few months. He said he would. I stood in the parking lot afterward for a few minutes, looking at the building. The ghost of the DK Auto decal was still faintly visible on the front window, a pale circle where Dylan's ambition had briefly stuck and then been removed. Marcus had already asked about new signage. His daughter had suggested calling it Webb's Garage, which I thought was exactly right. Dion was waiting for me in the parking lot of my house when I got home. Just him, not Brooke. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping, which was probably accurate. He'd lost weight in 3 weeks. The confidence he'd carried for years, that particular ease of someone who believes the future is going to keep accommodating him, was entirely gone. Uncle Gerald. He started walking toward me before I'd even shut the truck door. Please, just let me say something. I stood by my truck and I waited. I know I was wrong. He stopped a few feet away. His voice was steady, but I could see the effort it was taking. I know the timing was I know. I have no excuse for that. But I genuinely thought you wanted to step back. I thought you were done. And Brooke, she had this plan, and I let her convince me that if we just... He stopped. Started again. I let her convince me that you'd be okay with it. That you'd be relieved. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you decided what I wanted without asking me. Yes. He didn't argue it. Yes, that's what I did. You did it while I was at your father's funeral. He flinched like I'd thrown something at him. I know. We stood there in my driveway for a moment. The neighbor's dog barked at something down the street. A car went by. Dylan, I said, I loved your father. I loved you. I gave you 11 years, and good wages and a title, and everything I could think to give you short of the deed to the building, which, as it turns out, is the only thing you actually wanted. That's not don't. My voice didn't rise. I didn't need it to. Don't tell me what it is or isn't. I know what it is. And here's what I want you to understand. I looked at him directly, the way I'd looked at him when he was 13 and I caught him lying about something small, and I needed him to understand that lying had a cost. I'm not angry. I was for about 48 hours, but I'm not anymore. I'm just done. The shop is sold. The money is mine. And whatever you and Brooke do next, you'll do it without my help. We have nowhere. You have a community college degree. 11 years of shop management experience, and a wife who apparently has an appetite for risk. Those are real assets, Dylan. Use them. I picked up my bag from the truck bed. I genuinely hope you land okay. I do. But I'm not going to be the net under you anymore. He stood there while I walked to my front door. I didn't look back. I heard him get in his car eventually. I heard him drive away. I made coffee and sat at Carol's kitchen table and thought about her for a while. She would have hated everything about this situation, the conflict, the family fracture, the legal machinery of it. She would have wanted me to find a way to forgive and restore and keep the family together. She was better at that than I ever was, but she also would have told me, quietly over coffee, that there are some things you can only forgive once the person who wronged you actually understands what they did, not what they got caught doing, what they did. Dylan knew he'd changed my locks. He didn't yet know what he'd actually done, which was decide that I was finished before I'd decided anything of the sort. That reckoning was going to take him longer than 3 weeks to reach. The Alaska deposit had already gone through. My waders were hanging in the garage. I had a fly rod that hadn't been out of its case in 4 years, and a guide named Pete, who came recommended by 3 different people on a fishing forum I joined the week before. 2 weeks later, I was standing in the Kenai River at 6 in the morning with cold water around my knees and a rainbow trout that had been fighting me for 4 minutes finally coming to rest beside my hand. I held it in the current for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the life in it, and then I opened my fingers and let it go. It disappeared into the green water without looking back. That's what starting over feels like, I think. Not a dramatic exit, not a final word, just a quiet act of releasing what you were holding so something else can begin. The $295,000 is sitting in an account earning interest while I figure out what the next chapter looks like. I'm thinking about something smaller, maybe a little consulting, helping other small shop owners with systems and pricing, the things I spent 40 years learning. Something I do because I want to, on the hours I choose, for the people who actually ask for my help. Marcus Webb texted me last week. The shop is doing well. His daughter has apparently appointed herself unofficial mascot and spends Friday afternoons doing her homework in the waiting room. He had a question about the alignment machine, which I answered in about 3 texts, and then he sent back a thumbs up and nothing else, which is exactly the right amount of communication. Dylan and Brooke rented a place in Maryville. I heard through my cousin Patrice. Dylan is working at a dealership again. I hope the job holds. I mean that without irony. I don't regret a single decision I made in those 2 weeks after the funeral. Not the locksmith, not the broker, not the sale, not the silence, not Alaska. Every decision was mine to make because everything had always been mine. They forgot that. For a little while, I almost let them convince me to forget it too. If you've ever had someone try to write you out of your own story, your own family, your own work, your own life, then you know this particular feeling. That moment of standing in a lit driveway, reading a note that assumes you'll just accept it and disappear. The choice, right there, between disappearing quietly and deciding that you are not, in fact, done. I was not done. If this story meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe to Sincere Revenge Stories. Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you want to hear what happened when my daughter-in-law tried to remove me from my own grandson's life, that story is waiting for you in the box on the left. I've been thinking about what Dylan actually believed when he taped that note to my door. I think he believed I was already gone. Not dead, but finished. Used up. He'd watched me slow down, step back, let him run things, and somewhere in his mind, that gradual handover had become a completed transaction. He'd taken the receipts but forgotten that the deed was never part of the deal. That's the part that stays with me, not the betrayal itself, but the thinking behind it. The idea that because I'd been generous, I must have been weak. That because I'd trusted him, I must not have been paying attention. People make that calculation about older men all the time. That age and generosity are the same as surrender. The law made it. He was wrong. And the wrongness had nothing to do with luck. It had everything to do with the difference between what a person shows you and what a person actually is. I spent 11 years showing Dylan the generous version of myself. The patient uncle, the one who covered the slow months, who gave him the title without the paperwork, who looked the other way when Brooke started treating the shop like it was already hers. I showed him that version because it was real. I genuinely wanted him to succeed, genuinely wanted the shop to outlast me in good hands. But generosity isn't the same as surrender, and patience isn't the same as indifference. I was paying attention the whole time. I just chose not to act until acting became necessary. That's what I'd call the intelligence of restraint. Not weakness dressed up as wisdom, but the actual discipline of knowing when to hold still and when to move. 40 years of working on engines taught me that. You don't force a seized bolt, you apply the right pressure at the right moment, and the thing gives way on its own terms. Dylan forced. He grabbed what he thought was already his and found out it wasn't. I waited until I had everything I needed, the documents, the attorney, the locksmith, the broker, and then I moved once cleanly in a direction he never saw coming. The harder thing, the thing I'm still sitting with, is what I owe Caro's memory in all of this. She would have wanted me to find a way through that didn't end with Dylan renting in Maryville and us not speaking. She had that gift, the ability to hold people accountable without cutting them off. I don't have that gift in the same measure. What I have is the ability to be clear, to say, this is what happened, this is what it cost, and this is where my responsibility ends. Dylan is a grown man with real skills and a family he chose to protect by throwing mine away. He'll find his footing, but finding it is his work now, not mine. I think that's the thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away. Not the revenge, not the sale, not Alaska. Though Alaska was genuinely beautiful, the thing I'd want you to hold on to is this. Knowing what's yours and being willing to defend it isn't cruelty. It's self-respect. You can love people deeply and still refuse to disappear for their convenience. You can be generous for 11 years and still draw a line on the day someone mistakes your generosity for their inheritance. The line doesn't erase the love. It just reminds everyone, including you, that you are always a person, not just a resource. Gerald's auto repair is Webb's garage now. Marcus's daughter does her homework in the waiting room on Fridays. I think Carol would have liked that.